So I want to talk about calling in this little section. You're sitting here in this space and hearing these grand kind of pictures of order and abundance in the cosmos, and you've heard one example of a person, but surely you're wondering, what in the world am I to do? What is my particular piece of this? And I want to tell you, I can actually tell you what your calling is. In the next 16 and a half minutes, we'll sort it all out. And I actually want to tell you that you don't have a calling. You have three callings. You have three callings that I am absolutely certain everyone in this room has. The first two, actually, we all share. They're not specific to you as an individual. And the third is a little more specific to you. The first calling, in some ways, we've already covered. It's the calling to bear the image of God. This means that just as God is a creator who created order and abundance, we will now add order and unleash abundance in the world. Just as God valued utility and beauty, we will create useful, beautiful things. So we've already kind of covered that. I'm not going to dwell on that, except to say that this is a calling we share with every other human being. This is not a Christian thing. Our neighbors, whether or not they share our faith or any faith, are made in the image of God. And the work that they are doing daily, to the extent it is good and worthwhile work, is in fact image-bearing work. And when we do it alongside our neighbors, we do it in basically the same way that they do it. There is no Christian architecture per se. There's no Christian restoration of a building. There's no Christian mathematics. What would that even be? I don't think there's Christian plumbing, but I am glad that some Christians are plumbers. But when my plumber arrives, I don't ask, are you a Christian or not? I just ask, are you going to faithfully plumb my plumbing? Is that the right verb? This is simply our shared human calling. And we don't need to spiritualize it. We just need to, now I really will make up a word, imagize it. We need to recognize that all along this was bearing the image of God. And we've had this kind of sacred secular idea in parts of the Christian church and some parts of Christian history that says, well, that doesn't matter. No, it absolutely matters, because God looked at everything and saw that it was very good once his image bearers were in the world to behold, cultivate, and create in it. So that's your first calling. Where are you adding order, discovering abundance, sustaining utility and beauty, cultivating and creating? You're bearing the image there. That's your calling. But there's a second calling that probably all of us in this room share, or at least can share, that is a little more specific. And it has to do with actually our very specific nature as people who are part of God's intervention in history, God's redemptive mission in history. It's part of what it is to be specifically Christian in the world. And this calling is to restore the image. So if our shared human calling with every other human being is to bear the image, there is a particular calling to restore the image in the world that is specifically the calling of the people of God. Because the world is not the way it was meant to be, because we are not who we were meant to be. The image has been lost in countless ways in the world. There's been a kind of comprehensive failure on the part of God's image bearers to actually bear the image, so that we have not exercised dominion over the world in the way we were meant to do. At times we've treated the world like a machine. We've tried to extract from it systems of control. We've sought and built things that were merely useful and not beautiful. David referencing the Berlin Wall makes me think of the brutal architecture. It wasn't even brutalist, which was a Western movement. It was just purely utilitarian, brutal architecture in which human beings were housed and all across the Soviet bloc, highly efficient, but not at all conducive to any kind of flourishing, merely useful, concrete, rectilinear, nothing beautiful about it. And then, of course, there's a kind of privileged reaction to that in parts of the world that's a kind of aestheticism that doesn't care about serving the neighbor and just sort of glories in anything that's kind of trendy or fashionable, but isn't engaged in creating something useful for human life. We've treated the world as merely material instead of seeing that it's meant to be shot through with symbolic power and meaning. Or we've treated the world as merely symbolic and pretended that the material world doesn't matter. And all of these, the sum of all of these distortions, is what Scripture calls idolatry. And idolatry is the story of how human beings didn't just exchange who they worshipped, and instead of worshiping the true Creator, worshiping parts of the creation. But it's also the story of how human beings themselves stopped being the image bearers they were meant to be. So the world is now full of false images and false image bearers, people playing gods that are not God. And wherever there's idolatry, there's injustice. Because injustice are social conditions that prevent flourishing from happening. And idolatry and injustice in the biblical mind go hand in hand. You can't separate these two categories. The prophets will turn on a dime from talking about worship of false gods to talking about exploitation of neighbor in unjust economic arrangements, because the two always go together. And what they have in common is a violation of the image. The worshiping of things that really can't bear the weight of transcendence, the attempt to play God in ways that don't actually reflect the true God, and the exploitation of neighbor that's necessary to sustain that kind of idolatry and injustice. So that the world now is full of kind of degraded images. And indeed, all of creation groans because the image bearers are not present in it. It groans awaiting the revealing of the sons of God, the children of God, those who fully would engage the world in the way they were meant to. So the second calling that we have is not just to bear the image. If the world if we had never fallen, we could just happily garden and eventually build cities, and it would be awesome. But the world fell, and after the fall, we built Babel. And in Babel, we tried to control every aspect of the world apart from God. In America, I call Babel the Declaration of Independence, and people really like that. And what does God do? Babel is Genesis 11. What does God do right after Genesis 11? After Genesis 11 comes Genesis 12, in which God singles out this couple, Abram and Sarah, and says, I am going to bless you. I'm going to make you a great nation and make your name great. Your descendants will be like the stars of the sky. And through you, all nations will be blessed. In other words, God, after the cacophony of Babel, which begins in control, ends in chaos, God says, I am going to introduce into this warped human story a people, a cultural tradition who are going to restore my image. They're going to live out once again proper dependence on me. They're going to cultivate and create in the world in ways that are governed by my law and by my spirit. Israel does not fully fulfill this commission, and so Israel becomes complicit in the idolatry and injustice around it in the ancient Near East, the empires of its time. And so after Israel comes Jesus, or in the midst of Israel comes Jesus, the one who is not just an image bearer, but the image of the invisible God. And he steps in and has this amazing capacity to bring flourishing wherever he goes. Because what God is up to this side of the fall, this side of Babel, is introducing back into the story of human culture, which is what history is, a people who will be an image restoring people. That's our distinctive calling as Christians. We cannot, in one sense, we can happily engage in bearing the image, cultivating and creating in all kinds of beautiful ways. And that's a perfectly appropriate human thing to do. But if you're serious about joining the people of God, you are going to ask, what would it take not just to bear, but also to restore the image in the world? And this means that the people of God end up overrepresented in two places. First, they end up overrepresented among the most vulnerable. The systems of idolatry and injustice in our world have created huge amounts of human and indeed creation-level vulnerability. And God sends his people to those places, the places that are most forgotten, that are most neglected, that are the ugliest because no one has cared for beauty, that are the least productive because no one has cared for utility, that have the least flourishing because no one has tended them. And God sends his people to the forgotten places because that's where the image has been most desperately lost. and where because the image is lost, the creation itself is sort of frustrated and futile and unable to bear the fruit it was meant to bear. So God's people are disproportionately represented among the vulnerable. And you can ask, in whatever setting you live and work, where around me is the image not being born? Where has the image been lost around me? Now, there are very obvious places where the image is lost, but the truth is, in the most pleasing, appealing skyscrapers, on the nicest floors of those skyscrapers, there's ways in which the image is being lost. And there are people within those systems and those firms who are not treated as image bearers, who are exploited in various ways. And there are others who exploit. And Christians will be constantly seeking out the point of vulnerability, the point of lostness, and acting to restore the image in that place. I think we saw this actually quite beautifully in what Sam is doing, going to these buildings that have just been neglected and bringing them back. The other place, though, that the people of God end up overrepresented is among the very powerful. It's just a funny thing about the people of God. They keep on showing up in king's courts. Nehemiah, Daniel, Esther in the Old Testament. Paul finds himself, this random itinerant preacher ends up via shipwreck in front of Felix and Festus, first of all, in his own province, but then eventually in Rome, in Caesar's court, guarded by Caesar's own palace guards, because if the image is going to be restored in the world, the people who most benefit, wittingly or unwittingly, from the systems of idolatry and injustice also need to be confronted with the reality of who God is. So the very strange distribution, I'm going to go super mathematical for a moment. Do you know the normal distribution is the bell curve, right? Some of you know this vaguely from like way back in math somewhere. But there's this other distribution that's called a bimodal distribution, and it has two humps rather than one hump in the middle. And you know what I think is the problem with a lot of our Christianity today is we settle for the normal distribution, and we just all want to be we just want to be like normal people in the middle. And that's the one thing the people of God almost never are. Just like solidly middle class and moderate and boring and wearing sweaters, right? The people of God, over and over, are sent to the poorest places and the most powerful places. And in both places, they confront injustice and idolatry, proclaim the good news of the God who made everyone in his image, poor and powerful alike, and bring renewal in both places. So don't be surprised when Christians, followers of Jesus Christ, the renewer of all things, are found in very powerful positions, but do pay attention to the ways in which they are reshaping those systems that elites have access to in ways that start to honor the image in all people. And don't be surprised when Christians are among the most poor and they actually discover among those who are seen as poor that they too can bear the image and that the image can be restored even in conditions of great material poverty. So your second calling is to ask, where am I sent where the image is lost? And how do I become part of restoring the image? That's the second one. And then we get to the third one. And let me say, if you get those first two right, you're pretty much done. Bear the image, restore the image. That's it. That's our whole assignment. And then there's this third thing, which I'm going to call your contingent calling. So bearing the image and restoring the image, your third calling is just your contingent calling. And contingent is a word that philosophers use in two ways, two related ways. Contingent means something that could be otherwise. It could be something else, but it just happens to be what it is. And in this sense, contingent is the opposite of necessary, something that has to be the way it is. And then the other meaning of contingent is something that depends on something else. A contingent thing depends on something else, so it's the opposite of independent. Everyone in this room has uncountable contingencies about our lives. Things that could be another way, and things that depend on other things being true. And they make us who we particularly are. And your contingent calling is just to make the most of whatever that is. Who are you today? And by the way, the only contingent thing you really have is today. You don't have a future. When we think about calling, we always think about the future. Here's what I'll do when I really get going on my calling. You don't have a future. Who knows what your future is? It's not yet. The only future you have is a necessary future, not a contingent future. It's the renewal of all things in which your life will be caught up with Christ's life, and you'll be ushered into God's great kingdom and his great banquet. We know that's true about your future. But what's going to happen tomorrow to you? Who knows? What's going to happen 5 years? Who knows? All you have is today, and then you have your past, which could have been otherwise, but now is what it is. And all callings, I've come to believe, begin much more with your past than some fantasized future. It's really the question, what has brought me to today? And how do I act today to bear and restore the image? We have all kinds of ways of pretending we're not contingent. The modern world is kind of one great exercise in pretending that we have some ability to control or predict or project into the future. But even our modern world itself is incredibly contingent. It could so easily be otherwise. In 1859, a mass coronal ejection came from the sun, and this incredible electromagnetic surge flowed across the Earth, happened to be in the path of it. And telegraph wires in Boston and New York started to sort of sing and hum on their own, and the telegraph operators could disconnect their power sources and just tap out messages to each other in 1859, saying, what is going on? If a mass coronal ejection happens today, that was 1859, if a mass coronal ejection happens today, every transistor in the world would fuse. Say goodbye to your smartphone. Say goodbye to electricity. It would all just end. So you might wonder, how likely is it this would happen? The United States government wondered. It asked the National Research Council to investigate, and they came back with the reassuring news that between now and 2022, there is only a 1 in 8 chance of a mass coronal ejection. What if the worst happens? What if the worst happens in your own life? Maybe you're contingently single today, not married. Maybe you will never marry. Maybe you are contingently married today. Maybe you will one day lose that marriage. Maybe you'll lose your whatever health you may have. You're contingently employed today. You may not be tomorrow. You will still be able to bear and restore the image no matter what comes. In fact, at the moments of greatest vulnerability will actually be the moments in your life, it is very likely that the most significant image bearing and image restoring of your life happens. All we have is today. And the only question we need to ask today is, with what I have, what would faithfully bear the image? And what would go to the places of greatest vulnerability available to me today, and the places of greatest power available or open to me today, and how could I be part of God's story, bearing and restoring his image in the world? That's your calling.